Western Hills, second installation. An unturned stone in the John F. Kennedy assassination. Disclaimer. I do not intend to harm or defame any person or organization mentioned herein. The intention is to report factual, publicly available information. However, admitting where speculation may call for further investigation of individuals and entities who, at the time of this publication, may have otherwise gone unaccounted for. This evidence has existed in the public property records and legal testimonies for the past 60 years. I have generally accepted the following mainstream theories, which have provided some validity to my own offering that will be revealed here. The Warren Commission report, including the ridiculous single-bullet theory, was a deliberate cover-up, which has already been demonstrable for decades. An additional shooter or shooters have also been demonstrable since the release of the Zapruder film and the original medical records. The evidence of the throat shot was lost when doctors attempting to still save President Kennedy's life cut the opening to insert a breathing tube. While this eliminated the medical evidence, it was originally recorded as an entry wound, i.e., at least 2 shooters. The Zapruder film still provides confirmation that President Kennedy was shot in the throat well before the magic bullet proposed by the Warren Commission allegedly traveled through his back, then upward, allegedly exiting his throat, and then, supposedly, hitting Governor Connolly in front of him in different places all over his body. I believe the many mainstream conspiracy theories that have implicated organized crime as contributors. I believe the mainstream conspiracy theories that have implicated the CIA as well as other political beneficiaries, such as Lyndon Baines Johnson. I also believe Ruth and Michael Payne were involved as CIA operatives in the orchestration of certain key figures. Summary of assumptions. The Warren Commission report was a cover-up. There was more than one shooter, i.e., a conspiracy. Ruth and Michael Payne were involved. At the beginning, I did not know where this exploration would lead. However, I suspected that if there were any validity to the concept of a conspiracy, then patterns of collaboration might be gleaned by studying the property records. Summary of allegations. An underground ring was established during the 1950s for possible purposes of property flipping, collusion, bid rigging, and money laundering. This ring mostly included some wealthy, prominent members of Irving society, who were home builders or contractors, as well as members of Irving City Council. This proposed ring flourished not only in Western Hills, where the Paynes and the Frasers lived, but also in several South Irving subdivisions. Some members or affiliates of this ring were later suspected of playing a role during the 1960s in orchestrating the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, but were cleared of charges. Other related members can now be identified and tied to the persons who were already suspected. A list of names will be produced by analyzing the following: property ownership history, official witness testimony, places of employment, church attendance, and guided speculation with predictive validity. Other significant findings to consider: Manning's employment, which placed Buell Fraser at the book depository, can be tied to this ring. 4 members of one specific family can now be implicated, 1 father and 3 sons, and only 1 was ever questioned by the FBI. Identification of a Lee Harvey Oswald lookalike who staged 2 sightings in Irving and Grand Prairie, Texas, who can also be tied to members of this alleged ring. Part 1. How did you meet Lee Harvey Oswald? Ruth Payne is known for her role in housing Marina Oswald, while Marina's husband, Lee Harvey Oswald, alleged assassin of John F. Kennedy, worked and lived in Dallas Mondays through Fridays. Lee Harvey Oswald would visit Marina and his child on the weekends, staying at the home of Ruth and Michael Payne. The person providing a ride for Lee Harvey Oswald to the Payne house on Fridays and then back to work at the Texas Book Depository on Mondays was a co-worker, Buell Wesley Fraser, who lived 4 houses down from the Paynes. I agree with the public statement of Lee Harvey Oswald that he was merely a patsy who was set up to take the fall for a much bigger organization. I believe that Buell Wesley Frazier was possibly an unsuspecting victim and a potential second patsy. Buell Frazier lived with his sister, Lennie Mae Frazier Randle, both of whom testified before the Warren Commission and were cleared of any foreknowledge or wrongdoing. However, an examination of their FBI statements and their Warren Commission testimony reveals several important contradictions. On November 22nd, the day of the assassination, the FBI took a statement from Lennie Mae Randle, and she stated that she had met Lee Harvey Oswald through her brother and has known Oswald and his wife for about 6 weeks. The FBI also took a statement from Buell Wesley Frazier on the day of the assassination. He stated that he had met Lee Harvey Oswald about a month before the assassination, at work. He said he saw he was a new man and walked up to him and asked if he was Lee. He figured he must be Lee because his sister had told him about him. In 1964, Buell Frazier also provided the following testimony before the Warren Commission. The first time I ever saw him was the first day he come to work. So in November of 1963, Lennie Mae Randle stated that she met Lee Harvey Oswald through her brother around October 14th. However, in March of 1964, she stated that she already knew about Lee Harvey Oswald simply from neighborhood talk, and she first met Marina at a neighbor's house next door to Ruth Payne, and that she had only met Marina, but not Lee, during the first week of October 1963. So in comparison, Lennie Mae Randle's testimony in November 1963 conflicts with her testimony in March of 1964, and it also conflicts with the testimony of her brother, Buell Frazier, taken by the FBI in November of 1963. Buell Frazier, however, does concur with himself between his testimony of November 1963 and March 1964. He states that he first heard about Lee Harvey Oswald through his sister Lennie, and that he had never met Lee until his first day on the job, mid-October. It appears that Lennie Mae Randle made a mistake stating that she met Lee Harvey Oswald through her brother Buell, as it would completely negate the narrative that would unfold later when the Warren Commission asked about how Lee Harvey Oswald got the job at the book depository with Buell. This misstep also sets the stage for continued contradictions between Lennie Mae Randle and Ruth Payne. Another fun fact about Ruth Payne: Paula and Paulette Ashby used to babysit for Ruth Payne. Interestingly, the Paynes would always say they were going to a meeting, but would never say where and would not leave a telephone number so the Ashbys could call, even if there was an emergency with one of the children. During that time, they observed communist literature as well as a shortwave radio. While snooping at the Paynes' house, the Ashby twins turned the radio on and blabbed to their classmates that they heard broadcasts in a foreign language. A classmate told their parents, and the parents filed a report with the police. Nothing further, of course, was done. Part 2. Massey versus Manning. Despite its flaws and cover-ups, the Warren Commission report captured a very significant piece to the puzzle when Buell Frazier was asked how he got the job at the Texas School Book Depository. In 1964, Buell Frazier provided the following testimony before the Warren Commission. Significantly, he stated, "So I went to one of these employment agencies. I went to several. The main one was Massey, the employment agency, and it is over there on Shady Grove Road." Mr. Frazier was asked to spell the name of the employment agency, and he replied with it again, "Massey?" "Yes. I believe it is Massey." From 1964 until circa 2021, the true identity of the employment agency that had placed Buell Frazier at the book depository had not been made known and was never pursued further by the Warren Commission. In his book, Steering Truth, published in 2021, Buell Frazier states that, "Over the next couple of weeks I spoke with several employment agencies with no luck. One day I drove past a place named Manning's." He later states, "While doing research for this book, I reviewed that testimony and noticed that I spoke incorrectly. The employment agency on Shady Grove was called Manning's, not Massey." In addition to correcting the misstatement that the name of the agency was Massey, there is another curious comment. Fraser also interjected that after he drove by the employment agency, he went home first to ask his sister what she knew about it. I considered the possibility that Buell Fraser had deliberately concealed the real name of the employment agency in 1964 and the insertion in 2021 of Lenny Mae Randle as the source of his knowledge about the agency served some purpose as a buffer that had been removed by clarifying the false name of Massey. Theories. In Fraser's original testimony, he stated he was simply driving around stopping at employment agencies. If he could not point to an alternate source, such as word of mouth or random chance, then it might look like he already knew where to go for employment at the book depository. Was he somehow corralled or directed to Manning's, and why would that be so problematic to state back in 1964? In his original testimony for the Warren Commission, Fraser stated that Manning's was the main one, as if everybody, including himself, already knew about it. If Manning's was already known by Buell Fraser to be the main one, then it seems doubtful he would need to run home to consult with Lenny about it instead of just stopping on in since he was driving past it while out searching for jobs. A possible reason to hide Manning's. It is possible the big secret was that Manning's employment agency also directly placed Lee Harvey Oswald at the Texas Book Depository, which would indeed be problematic if made public. It appears Ruth Payne had to step in and fabricate a cover story that she called down to the book depository after Lenny had told her that her brother Buell had found work there. She states, "I looked up the number in the book and dialed it, was told I would need to speak to Mr. Truly. I said I know of a young man whose wife was staying in my house. The wife was expecting a child. They already had a little girl, and he had been out of work for a while and was very interested in getting any employment and his name." However, Ruth's testimony conflicts with Lenny's in a very significant way. Mr. Jenner asks Mrs. Payne, was any possible place of employment in addition to the Texas School Book Depository mentioned? Mrs. Payne, no. Mr. Jenner, you have no recollection of any other suggestion as to possible places of employment? Mrs. Payne, I have no recollection of that. Mr. Jenner, you have no recollection of any other, at least 2 other places being suggested, and you, in turn, stating that they would be unsatisfactory, one because an automobile had to be used, or it would be necessary for Lee to have an automobile, and the other that he was lacking in the possible qualifications needed. None of that refreshes your recollection? Mrs. Payne, none of that refreshes my recollection. Now let's consider Lenny Mae Randle's testimony. Mr. Ball, you and Mrs. Roberts and Mrs. Payne talked about it? Mrs. Randle, we listed several places that he might go look for work. When you live in a place, some places that someone with, not very much of an education can find work. So it was among one of those places that we mentioned. We mentioned several others, and Mrs. Payne said that, he couldn't apply for any of the jobs that would require driving because he couldn't drive. Of the numerous employment opportunities that were talked about among the ladies, Manor Bakeries and Texas Gypsum were specifically called out by name, yet Ruth Payne has no recollection of any of this conversation. Lenny Mae Randle's November 28, 1963 testimony to the Secret Service essentially states that Ruth Payne and Dorothy Roberts were working together to steer or manipulate Lenny Mae Randle into being the patsy who would take the credit for calling down to the book depository on Lee Harvey Oswald's behalf. Lenny shrewdly refused. They questioned me only about the Texas School Book Depository job. Mrs. Payne seemed to hop on to that. She asked me if I would call down there, but I said no. She would have to call down or contact the man herself. But why wouldn't one of them simply drive Lee Harvey Oswald to the same employment agency that allegedly placed Buell Fraser there? By placing Buell Fraser there, Manning's obviously had a direct connection to place employees at the book depository. Likewise, if no job was available at the depository, who better than an employment agency to help navigate such obstacles as no ability to drive or limited education and skills in order to help find another job? I suspect the burden of calling down to the book depository is really just part of the cover story for who got stuck taking the hit for Manning's as the one who arranged for Lee Harvey Oswald's placement at the book depository. Whether Ruth Payne truly called and spoke to Mr. Truly, or whether she simply provided a fictitious veneer for the real way Oswald was employed there, it is clear that all parties shared the common motive of hiding Manning's. Ruth Payne versus Lennie Mae Randle. Lennie painted Ruth into a corner because she said they discussed multiple places for Lee Harvey Oswald to look for work, and it was essentially Ruth who shot all the other options down and suggested the book depository was the only viable option since Lee needed a ride. Why did Ruth Payne insist that she only recalled discussing one place, the school book depository? I suspect she was nervous about taking too much credit for placing Oswald at the book depository in case the whole scam fell apart during the testimonies. Yet, it was necessary for her to interject that she had called down to the book depository herself to arrange the job interview because that likely took the focus off of the real source, which I suspect was Manning's. As is typical when potential accessories to a crime are trying to maintain the same lie, they sometimes accidentally contradict each other when questioned separately. It appears in 1964, as long as possible, concealing Manning Employment Agency's role was essential in maintaining the cover-up. The Warren Commission did not bother to verify if Massey was even a legitimate company. I suspect it was a deliberate omission. If Manning's had a role in placing not only Frazier but Oswald too at the school book depository, it would explain the conflicting testimonies and the soft peddling by the Warren Commission to probe any deeper. Perhaps a reopened federal investigation could still delve into the business records of this company and any of its subsidiaries to see what else can be gleaned. More on the Mannings a little later. I also theorized that whether a young 19-year-old Buell Frazier had foreknowledge or had simply realized later that he had been manipulated into the role he played, there must have been more going on in the neighborhood. Could Western Hills, too, have served as a staging area where not only Ruth Payne managed Marina and Lee, but where others might have served as the handlers or directors of the Fraziers? The property records provide some very interesting information. Part 3. The Property Shepherds. My theory. First consider, during the early 1960s, the CIA, FBI, and police were able to tap phone lines, and it was common practice in espionage. There were no cell phones or internet. Being able to easily stop by somebody's home to deliver a message or instructions would be essential when expediency and privacy mattered. Of particular significance within Western Hills, too, there is no testimony from a particular occupant at the Fraziers, the home at 2439 West 5th Street. Likewise, the actual owner of the house was never questioned either. What has been glaringly absent from the Warren report is the testimony of the men in the Randle family. Alfred E. Randle, owner and landlord, father of Bill Randle, World War I veteran in the British Army, cabinet maker. William Bill Randle, tenant, son of Alfred Randle, husband of Lennie Mae Frazier Randle, president of the Irving Republican Club, cabinet maker. Bill Randle also worked at the family business Irving Countertop, along with his father Alfred and brother Marvin. We'd be remiss not to ask why the Randle family couldn't have simply gotten an able-bodied young man like Buell Frazier a job at Irving Countertop, or possibly ask some of their other construction connections if they could help him. Despite such great opportunities to enter the construction industry where manual laborers are always necessary, it seems apparent that Buell Frazier was destined for only one location. Based on this oddity, I theorized that Alfred and Bill Randle were given protected status, possibly due to their notable military and political accomplishments, as well as future political aspirations, or possibly due to their direct involvement. Consider that when a renter is busted for something, such as selling drugs, the landlord's property is usually frozen as a sellable asset and is questioned as to the knowledge of what activities were taking place. Shouldn't there have at least been the same level of scrutiny when the President of the United States was assassinated? Why was the landlord of this property never questioned? There is also a third politically significant member of the Randle family that ironically owned the house directly across the street from Ruth Paine. That the Warren Commission deliberately ignored this connection, Marvin Randle, and these possible accessories is appalling, but it gets worse. Marvin Randle, son of Alfred Randle, brother of Bill Randle, former mayor of Irving, cabinet maker. Based on the testimony by Lennie Mae Randle, Marvin Randle leased the house he owned across the street from the Paines to none other than Lennie and Bill. Mrs. Randle: Well, for a period, I am not sure of this, it is quite 2 years. I lived across the street from her. I didn't visit with her. Likewise, Lennie Mae Randle claims that during the 2 years she lived across the street from Ruth, she never visited her, yet she did visit her next-door neighbor, Dorothy Roberts, and had coffee with Ruth Paine. Mrs. Randle: I had gone up there to see Mrs. Roberts and her, Mrs. Oswald, and Mrs. Paine was over there drinking coffee. In 1964, attorney Joseph Ball let Lennie Mae Randle dodge the yes-no question of whether she knew Ruth Paine before meeting her on the fateful day that she arrived with Marina Oswald. However, Lennie already admitted she did know Ruth Paine when she was interviewed by the Secret Service on November 28, 1963. I would not say that I am overly friendly with Mrs. Paine, but I am acquainted with her. How could she not be when she had lived across the street from her for 2 years and they were mutual friends with Dorothy Roberts? This highly significant coincidence that the Randles owned both properties, housing Lennie there in such proximity to the Paines both times, was deliberately ignored by the Warren Commission. Let's look closer at this period of time that Lennie Mae Randle lived across the street and then moved down the street from the Paines. Based on my belief that Ruth and Michael Paine were involved in the conspiracy, I speculated that further property activity within the neighborhood would be deliberate after the arrival of the Paines. Let's see. With their houses facing each other and with mutual friends like the Roberts next door to the Paines, it appears the Randles and the Paines would have inevitably known each other since 1960, and I suspect that they had similar motives when they both purchased properties in Western Hills, No. 2. I concur with the mainstream theory that John F. Kennedy made enemies within the CIA and military-industrial complex due to his decisions to withhold air support during the Bay of Pigs around April 1961. I propose that any actions within Western Hills No. 2 after the Bay of Pigs were deliberate, and will attempt to support this theory with the history of property sales on West 5th Street. I theorize that it would have taken about 12 to 18 months after the Bay of Pigs for the upper-tier forces behind the conspiracy to establish a plot, determine a city for the hit, move money around, and then purchase houses in a targeted neighborhood as they became available. This may explain why it took almost 2 years from the time Marvin Randle purchased his house across the street from the Paines at the dawn of 1961 before any significant action was made, which occurred in November 1962. The fact that Marvin Randle sold his rent house at 2514 the same month that his father Alfred bought 2439 down the street is quite significant. It appears a decision was made, essentially 1 year before the assassination, to move pawns of the chessboard to a less conspicuous location than directly across the street from Ruth Paine. When 2439 became available for sale, the orchestrators appeared to have decided sending Lee Harvey Oswald across the street in front of every other house on the block to catch a ride with his driver might draw more attention than sending him down the street a ways to a corner lot that was a little more concealed. This also provided more separation for, i.e. protection for, the queen of the chessboard, Ruth Paine. Please note, it is important to point out here that one of the significant takeaways from Max Good's documentary about Ruth Paine is that the CIA often operates within familial circles, and it is now well known that Ruth Paine's father and sister both have worked for the CIA before. When confronted with this important fact, Ruth Paine essentially laughs it off and continues to act oblivious. I must be cautious with my allegations. I do not know if the Randle family was operating on behalf of the CIA, nor some other entity that may rely on familial bonds to maintain their organization. However, here again, we see a familial level of collaboration among the Randles in the housing of Lennie Mae Randle, within walking distance of Ruth Payne, one father and two sons. Buying properties takes time, weeks or months, and money, more money than most average people have on hand. It also requires a willing seller to facilitate such transactions. How could these complex variables be managed? The answer: a shepherd or shepherds that can not only keep watch over the flock of homes in the neighborhood, but also control the buying and selling of the homes. During 1954 and a couple of years that followed, the land located within the Western Hills subdivision was all purchased by Louis Blaylock and W.H. Roberts, who also owned Roberts Building Company. Between 1954 and 1956, Blaylock and Roberts literally owned the neighborhood and also controlled what order the properties were built upon. They also appear to have had some degree of control over who got to live in the properties, as they could withhold putting any given home on the market for sale on a discretionary basis. Also of significance, by 1963 it appears that John Randle, misspelled, worked as a carpenter for Blaylock Construction. There is a high likelihood that John L. Randle could be John C. Randle. In addition to the obvious connection of being a carpenter, which was a common trade within the Randle family, and then working for Blaylock Construction, who was also tied to W.H. Roberts as well as other members of the Randle family. Why else do I think John L. Randle and John Clifford Randle are the same people? A combination of honest and/or deliberate mistakes, perhaps? The Polk's city directory already misspelled Bill Randle's last name in the exact same way. They also got middle initials wrong, as Marvin's middle initial was H, not A. Even the name Fern may have been a simple confusion of notes on the part of the Polk's record taker. The FBI actually questioned Naomi Gabriel, administrative assistant to the sales manager of R.L. Polk & Company, the publishers of the city directory. A house-to-house canvasser is required to make 3 personal contact attempts at the person's residence in a given neighborhood. If a canvasser is unable to contact the resident on the 3rd attempt, a postcard is mailed for them to fill out and return. If the postcard is unreturned, then the canvasser will, as the report states, resort to second-hand information, that is, neighborhood contact, in an effort to obtain the information. In other words, gossip. With such methods, there is certainly room for errors to be made. Why, even by 1972, John Clifford Randle, as well as youngest brother Don, seemed to be the victims of improperly spelled last names. Theirs are both spelled differently from each other, but the rest of the Randle family is just fine. Is the problem still merely incidental with Polks, or more deliberately with certain members of the Randle family? What else would support my theory that John L. Randle is also John C. Randle? The D that denotes the city of Dallas for John Randle's Daisy Lane address is actually part of the outskirts of Irving City proper. John appears to have been a tenant at 1213 Daisy Lane, which was conveniently 1 mile from Irving Countertop, also only 1 mile from 2001 Carl Road, where construction began on the Thunderbird Apartments in 1962. Thunderbird Realty is one of Louis Blaylock's businesses. John's residence at 1213 Daisy Lane was conveniently also 2.4 miles from the subdivision Blaylock built through the 1950s, which was also a few blocks from one of Blaylock's other business addresses at 111 South Main, and just 2.5 miles from Blaylock's other address, which is just a half a mile from Western Hills. Until there is more evidence to the contrary, I will assume John L. Randle and John C. Randle are the same people. If I'm correct, then this establishes a long-standing link between the Randle family, the Blaylocks, and the Roberts. It appears that as the 2 oldest brothers, Bill and John may have been the ones who first established the connections with Louis Blaylock and W.H. Roberts. Then, by the time Marvin Randle was old enough, he may have been led, perhaps unwittingly at first, down the path by his 2 older brothers. It seems we now have 4 members of the Randle family who can all be directly tied to the people I allege to be the property shepherds, not only in Western Hills, but in the entire southern portion of Irving during the 1950s. Of all the properties in Western Hills subdivision, as well as around the city of Irving and Dallas County, W.H. and Dorothy Roberts just happened to live next door to Ruth Payne. According to Lennie Mae Randle, she visited with her neighbor who lives next door, and when asked who that was, it was Mrs. Dorothy Roberts. Could the Roberts have been the shepherds who were able to reserve homes in such close proximity for the conspirators? Let's take a closer look. As I continued mapping the property timeline, I speculated that by the time the Paynes would have arrived, the shepherd network must have already been in place. If true, other conspirators might have been connected in some other way as a nefarious organization that existed long before any notions of an assassination plot. I spotted 2 possible examples in Western Hills No. 2 pertaining to the owners in question. As a network of straw buyers used to flip properties, or as a possible contractor's collusion ring. For example, at 2514 West 5th, on April 5, 1960, the Hallmarks sell to Kenneth D. Reynolds, who only held the property for just 7 months. Then, in December of 1960, Reynolds sells to Marvin Randle. Kenneth Reynolds, in his early days, lived in Irving and was owner and operator of Reynolds Properties. He served as mayor pro tem on the Irving City Council, where he was involved in the construction of the original Texas Stadium. I proposed that Kenneth Reynolds ran in the same circles as the Randles, especially Marvin, through Irving political connections as well as construction opportunities. I propose he had the financial means to buy a property quickly, maybe with cash, whereas Marvin Randle may have needed to secure resources or was not yet selected to receive the house. I propose he only held the location for 7 months, perhaps because he was invited to serve as the middleman and only thought it was an opportunity to make a quick profit for flipping a property. But it clearly looks like he was a straw buyer who stepped in for Marvin Randle. It seems likely that Marvin Randle did not purchase the house from him by random chance. Among other potential home buyers scouring the city of Irving, Texas in 1960, I suspect they must have had some arrangement that Marvin Randle would be the sole intended buyer of the home from Reynolds because he needed to be placed directly across the street from Ruth Payne. Kenneth Reynolds helped other prominent members of Irving. For example, he fronted $14,500 in the form of a mechanic's lien to build the home of Paul Barger, Irving Chief of Police, and gave him 5 months to secure a loan and pay him back. Naturally, the mayors and police chief should work hand in hand, but during the 1950s and 60s, the good old boy network was quite real, and one hand washes the other. This article on Paul Barger was actually saved and submitted to the Irving archives by Marvin Randle himself. As is common in politics, they all appear to be buddies. The fact that Reynolds purchased the property that would ultimately be turned over to Marvin Randle within 1 month of the Paynes purchasing their home across the street lends further credibility that these transactions were not merely random chance. April 1960, Kenneth Reynolds purchases 2514 West 5th Street. May 1960, Michael Payne purchases 2515 West 5th Street. As previously noted, Marvin Randle appears to have purchased 2514 rather quickly, 8 months after Kenneth Reynolds purchased it. Likewise, when it was decided to dump the property, Marvin Randle did not sell it to an individual buyer or family that might have come along by chance. He sold it to another institution with deep pockets that might be able to pay out a large sum of money quickly, a life and accident insurance company. Very curious. At 2515 West 5th, Ruth and Michael Payne's house, at first glance, things appear to be more normal in the chain of ownership. However, if we broaden our focus just a little bit, we will see things that might be evidence of collusion among builders who should be competitors in their industry. How does collusion work? Although the producer of this presentation knows of credible witnesses to such events, for the purpose of this example, all parties and situations are purely hypothetical. Contractors A, B, and C bid on a public works project for the city, where it is assumed that the three independent companies are competing on price, the bid, to build or install something, say, a new subdivision of houses. Unbeknown to the owner or specifier, the three companies have already agreed that they can make more money dividing up the work equally when it is bid at a premium price, instead of having to compete individually and offer the lowest possible price. Once the contractors have agreed upon who has claim to be the lowest bid for each opportunity, they literally run numbers to each other. Contractor A establishes the price that they can credibly justify while maximizing their profit margin, then sends an errand boy to deliver two higher prices in sealed envelopes to key figures at contractors B and C. The owner typically awards the job to the lowest bid, assumed they got a good deal, and never realizes how they just got fleeced. I believe my credible sources that, while such things don't happen every time, they do happen when the ring is able to surround a bid opportunity. In addition to Kenneth D. Reynolds and Roberts Building Company, both C.B. Hardy and Noel Mealer were also contractors. Like Roberts, both Hardy and Mealer appear on numerous deeds in Irving and throughout Dallas County, and it is apparent they too had certain subdivisions that were awarded to them. In the case of 2439, it appears Mealer held the house for only 6 months and flipped it to a Smith couple who held it for a little over 1 year and then sold it back to Mealer. Mealer held the property for 4 years before selling it to Alfred Randle. It is probable that Mealer kept 2439 as a rental property and then may have been prompted to sell so that the home could be used as a better alternate to Marvin Randle's house at 2514. In the case of 2515 and 2511, C.B. Hardy owned those properties during the late 50s. C.B. Hardy also shared another thing in common with Kenneth Reynolds and Marvin Randle. Hardy was another mayor of Irving between 1951 and 1957. In a U.S. Department of the Interior National Park Service report, as it pertains specifically to 2515 West 5th, Ruth and Michael Payne's house, C.B. Hardy is quoted as saying that things are popping so fast you just don't hear of some new developments until the houses are already going up. The same report tells us that C.B. Hardy started construction on the house before he owned the lot because the home and land were sold to Joyce and Jimmy P. Bratcher on March 20th, 1956, only 2.5 weeks after the sale of the empty lot. As the report goes on to state, Irving's expansion and growth was quite good with a builder leading the city government. How much did Hardy make on this sale? And how often were such off-the-radar deals done? Another place C.B. Hardy identified as one of his home addresses during the 1960s was at 500 West 6th Street, known as the Riviera Apartments, just 2 minutes down the street from 511 East 6th Street, the Capri Apartments. Numerous attendees of the Russian party where the Oswalds, the Paynes, and the DeMornshields all met lived in the Capri Apartments. There were the Friedrichsons, Norman and his unnamed wife, and Florence E. MacDonald and Betty MacDonald. Is it possible C.B. Hardy might have paid them a visit sometime or even hitched a ride to the party? Before you answer, I should inform you of this. The Irving truck tracts, including the section of Shady Grove that had Manning's employment, was all purchased by an Emil Makalovsky from 1949 through the early 1950s and then sold to C.B. Hardy during his time as mayor through 1957. Not from a Mr. Smith, Jones, or Williams, but Makalovsky. W.H. Boots Roberts also ran in the same political circles, having aspired to be on Irving City Council and often participating in the same public events as C.B. Hardy. In a neighborhood like Western Hills No. 2 during the 1960s, we should expect most home sales to simply roll from one independent working-class family to the next, which we do see in most cases, without so many curious anomalies. I implore those in authority to reopen this case and dig deeper here. A reopened investigation should look for any similar background of the people associated with these properties to other prominent figures already named. relatives in the CIA or other secretive organization, military background, political influence, locally or federally, owners of contracting companies, deep pockets. Likewise, there may be another piece to the puzzle implicating C.B. Hardy in the connection to the Manning Employment Agency. C.B. Hardy, in red, who obviously did deals with Roberts Construction, not only owned and sold the property that served as the storefront for Manning's employment to Charles and Emmeline Manning, in yellow, Hardy also had a home located just down the street from the Manning property. I suggest that this provides another link between the Shepherds of Western Hills No. 2 and Manning Employment. And there is more. Yet another connection that these individuals knew each other well before the assassination was conceived. Martha Lovelet Wilhoit was sister of Emmeline Lovelet Manning. She essentially ran Manning Employment during the interim period after Emmeline's death. The Wilhoits were members of the First Baptist Church of Irving. C.B. Hardy sold the storefront property for Manning's employment to Charles A. and Emmeline Lovelet Manning. He had a house 4 doors down from Manning's employment. He went to the same church as W.E. and Bessie D. Manning, next-door neighbor to the Randle Fraser home at 2439 West 5th. He went to the same church as Martha Lovelet Wilhoit of Manning Employment. All these families were not just congregational members, but also attended Sunday school class together. Their unacquaintance during the early 1960s within such an institution would be virtually impossible. And though he did not join until later in his adulthood, Buell Fraser also went to this church, the First Baptist Church of Irving. Just how long ago and how did Buell Fraser know about Manning's? I will return to this question a little later. The Schneiders also owned the 3 houses on the other side of Ruth Payne. Some were vacant during the time of the assassination. Like other significant figures, such as C.B. Hardy and Martha and Blaine Wilhoit, who are alleged to be involved in the property investment ring, the Schneiders also attended the First Baptist Church of Irving. Remember Dorothy Roberts, the other next-door neighbor to Ruth Payne, mutual friend of Lennie Mae Fraser Randle. Dorothy Roberts hosted the get-together where Marina Oswald was introduced to Lennie Mae Randle. Dorothy Roberts, who, with Ruth Payne, attempted to persuade Lennie Mae Randle to call the Texas Book Depository and ask for Lee Harvey Oswald's job interview. Husband W.H. Roberts built all of the homes in the neighborhood and is the person I've named as the property shepherd. As it turns out, Dorothy Roberts allegedly told Mr. Schneider that she saw Bill Randle, not Buell Fraser, take Lee Harvey Oswald to work on the day of the assassination, according to Warren Commission Report Document 296. The Warren Commission naturally did not bother to verify this claim with the Roberts or the Schneiders. Document 296 may provide evidence that the Roberts were working to frame the occupants of 2439 West 5th as patsies, Buell Fraser, Lennie Mae Fraser Randle, and Bill Randle, by planting rumors through their neighbors, co-conspirators, and diverting attention from their side of the neighborhood. Note that Ed Roberts appears to be either an inadvertent or deliberate name switch from W.H., who is the confirmed owner of the property at 2519 West 5th Street. If we stand in the middle of the street in front of Dorothy Roberts' house and look down toward the Fraser Randle home at 2439 West 5th Street, it would be very difficult to see. How would Dorothy Roberts have been able to see whether Bill Randle or Buell Fraser had taken Lee Harvey Oswald to work on that day? Was she really standing out on the sidewalk in front of her home? Or does she claim to be peering out the window, which would be impossible? Even from the Schneider's driveway at 2507, we cannot see around the corner to the Randall's driveway. We must begin to round the corner at 2503 West 5th before we can see the Randall's driveway. The kitchen window and driveways of 2439 West 5th faced Westbrook. It was virtually impossible for Dorothy Roberts to have seen who took Oswald to work on November 22nd. Therefore, we have two possibilities. One, Dorothy Roberts may have planted this story through Mr. Schneider to manipulate the testimonies for some reason. Dorothy Roberts apparently knew the Schneiders well enough to have told them that she saw Bill Randle, not Buell Frazier, take Oswald to work, whether true or false. As owners of multiple properties next to the Paynes, as well as disseminators of Dorothy Roberts' narrative, the Schneiders may also be implicated in the property investment ring, but appear unwilling to take credit for Dorothy Roberts' rumor. So, in that case, number 2, could it be that the Schneiders inadvertently provided an accurate eyewitness testimony that was somehow taken over by Dorothy Roberts as a form of damage control? What if the Schneiders did see Bill Randle leave with Lee Harvey Oswald on the morning of the assassination? Part 4. Bill Randle's Trip to Austin with Barry Castor. What else can be known about Bill Randle? He was documented to have been in Austin, Texas for a business trip on the day of the assassination. On this trip, the Secret Service reported that Bill Randle was overheard in the hotel lobby to have commented that if the president came to Dallas, he would be killed because the Veterans Administration offices were being moved out of Dallas. He also commented that he already knew Lee Harvey Oswald because he lived in the neighborhood. Of course, when he was interviewed by the Secret Service, he denied these claims. Bill Randle was reported to have been traveling with an associate, Barry J. Castor, according to the November 28, 1963 Secret Service report, spelled B-E-R-R-Y, like the fruit. According to the FBI, Bill tried to call Marvin Randle from the hotel around 7:30 p.m., but could not reach him. Bill Randle reportedly did not talk to his brother Marvin until nearly 11 p.m., November 22nd, the day of the assassination. Bill Randle reportedly returned to Dallas on an 11:05 p.m. flight Friday evening. The Austin motel was located about 12 to 15 minutes from the airport. The hotel attendant reported to the FBI that it was about 11 o'clock when Bill Randle returned to receive Marvin's message and call him back. Bill would need at least 15 minutes to drive to the airport, plus time to go through whatever modicum of security may have been there. It may be safe to assume that Bill Randle arrived back at the Austin motel after 10 p.m., but with enough time to scurry to the airport. Also noteworthy, although Bill Randle had driven down to Austin for a business trip, which could have been located anywhere in town, it is quite convenient that he chose to stay at a hotel so close to the airport. It seems Bill anticipated having to fly back home that day. Likewise, how convenient that Bill had one of the fine young Castor boys there who he could trust to drive the car back for him. It seems there could have been some planning involved to mitigate some of the inconveniences that would have been anticipated. Before we go further, I should clear the air. The Secret Service report on Bill Randle's trip to Austin conflicts with the FBI report on the same trip. According to the Secret Service, Bill Randle was in Austin on Saturday, November 23rd. The date of November 23rd appears to be a mistake, as all described events would have taken place on the 22nd, which was the day of the assassination. They also reported that Bill Randle caught the 5 o'clock flight to return home. How could Bill Randle have talked to Marvin and then left Austin on the 5 o'clock flight, according to the Secret Service, when the FBI told us that he played phone tag for several hours and did not talk to Marvin until just before 11 p.m., and then did not leave Austin until sometime after 11:05 p.m.? We can possibly answer this question if we determine where Lenny and Buell Frazier were during this time. The report by Dallas police detectives Rose, Stovall, and Adamczyk indicates that Lenny Randle walked down the street and volunteered to assist sometime after 3:45 p.m. while they were searching the Paynes house. Likewise, the Paynes did not reach the Dallas police station until about 6 o'clock p.m., so presumably Lenny arrived there around the same time. The Dallas officer's report also notes that there was much traffic during that time and it took a while to reach the police station. Therefore, by the time the police investigation was completed in Western Hills, the soonest Marvin Randle might have realistically called Bill Randle in Austin to inform him that Lenny was taken to the police station would have been probably close to 5 o'clock p.m. on Friday, November 22nd. Bill would not have had much time to catch a 5 o'clock flight after receiving the news. This matches the timeline of the FBI report better than the Secret Service report. The Dallas officer's report also tells us that Lenny and her brother Buell Wesley Frazier were not actually back home until 2 o'clock a.m. Saturday morning. This conflicts with the Secret Service report, which said they were home by the time Bill Randle arrived in Dallas. So, which report should we believe? I lean toward the FBI. The FBI report got the date correct, has better details, such as the phone numbers, plus also aligns better with the Dallas officer's report. Why would the Secret Service, or Bill Randle, in his testimony to them, have tried to conceal such details? The Secret Service report only mentioned that Marvin had called Bill as if Marvin reached him on the first attempt. It appears they were trying to obscure the period where Bill and Marvin played phone tag. It is possible between November 28th, when the Secret Service report was made, to the 30th, when the FBI report was made, Bill Randle probably figured out that he could not sweep the details under the rug so easily. So again, the FBI report, as the latter testimony, appears to be more consistent with other known details of the same day. Perhaps the detail the Secret Service or Bill Randle wanted to conceal was the fact that Marvin Randle was also hanging out in Western Hills on the day of the assassination. What was Marvin Randle doing at Bill Randle's house while Buell and Lenny were tied up at the Dallas police station the entire evening? I do admit that Bill and Lenny had 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9. While conceivable that Marvin may have been there to watch the kids, S.E. Mae Williams, Lenny and Buell's mother, was already there from out of town, too conveniently, perhaps, to watch the children. I don't think even Uncle Marvin could trump Grandma as the person who would be watching the grandchildren under such circumstances. How do I know Marvin was there? Let's see. According to the FBI, Bill tried to call Marvin at BL3 9040 around 7:30 p.m. Somebody, presumably Marvin, called Bill back and left a message to call a different number, BL3 8965. BL3 9040 was Marvin Randle's home phone number, a logical place to try to reach Marvin Randle. However, BL3 8965, the number Marvin left for Bill to call back, was Bill's own home number. It appears Marvin Randle was calling Bill back from Bill's own home and then waited there for his return call. Why? Important points to note. Marvin was apparently the person Bill could trust and count on to inform him of the situation back in Irving. Marvin, as pointed out in the main presentation, had been involved in the ownership and rental of 2514 West 5th across the street from Ruth Payne for 2 years leading up to the assassination. The fact Marvin had Bill call him back at the address on 2439 West 5th Street instead of Marvin's home address is peculiar, unless Marvin Randle, too, was a stakeholder in the plot. Even on the day of the assassination, Marvin Randle was at the same staging area where so many other suspicious events had taken place. Was he there to get an update after Lenny and Buell returned from the police station, and or possibly advise or direct them during Bill's absence? Unfortunately, we will never be able to ask Marvin Randle these questions. He passed away on June 7th, 2025. Part 5. Barry versus Benny. There is no record of a Barry J. Castor living in Irving, but there was a Benny J. Castor. He was an Air Force veteran, mechanic, built engines for military aircraft, and helped convert cargo planes into bombers during the Vietnam War. Similar career path to Michael Payne? Unfortunately, Benny J. Castor passed away on January 14, 2025. I was 2 months too late to go knock on his door. In addition to being Bill Randle's co-worker at Irving Countertop, Benny J. Castor lived in some notable places in Dallas County. Benny J. Castor gave his parents' address, 214 West Shady Grove, to the FBI. His parents' home was situated within 1 mile of Manning's employment and 2 miles from Western Hills. Benny J. Castor and his first wife, Patsy, had by 1966 purchased 430 Collins in the Mayflower edition of Irving, where we will see the Castors owned a couple of houses. There is a possibility that Benny may have been renting at this address during the time of the assassination. A would-be Lee Harvey Oswald sighting around March or April of 1963 in the city of Irving was eerily close to Western Hills and the Mayflower edition. A gas station attendant claimed that he purchased a rifle for $12 from the passenger of a car that was driven by a man who needed repairs but didn't have any money. The man from whom the attendant purchased the rifle was reported to have looked just like Lee Harvey Oswald after his face had become known in the media. Curiously, Bill Randle lived 1/2 mile, 2 minutes, from the service station where the alleged Lee Harvey Oswald sighting was reported. It was on the southwest corner of Rock Island and Story Road. Numerous prominent JFK researchers have all suspected that there were impersonators for Lee Harvey Oswald, especially at certain staged events. Jim Garrison, Harold Weisberg, Sylvia Meager, Mark Lane, John Armstrong, David Lifton. I think I know who at least 1 or 2 of them were during 2 different incidents in Dallas County. So who was the Lee Harvey Oswald lookalike that Bill Randle possibly drove to the service station? It wasn't Bill Wesley Frazier. He arrived in Irving during early fall of 1963. It was possibly Lee Harvey Oswald. Marina began living in Irving during April 1963. However, it is highly likely that it was Benny Joe Castor. What do you think? On the left, Benny Joe Castor. On the right, Lee Harvey Oswald. But I'm going to double down on this bet. Benny Joe also had a younger brother named Lloyd. If he isn't the spitting image of Lee Harvey Oswald, I don't know who is. I find it intriguing that all of these young men were barely out of high school and had military aspirations. Bill Wesley Frazier, Lee Harvey Oswald, Benny Castor, Lloyd Castor. It is quite possible the Schneiders saw Bill Randle leaving with one of the Castor boys as they set out for Austin on their business trip, which was also on the morning of the assassination. And in that case, it appears the story was directed back to the Roberts to control the problematic information that the Schneiders may have accidentally stated. In either case, it appears all roads lead back to the Roberts as either the originators or the controllers of the incongruent statement that Bill Randle had taken Oswald to work, instead of the widely accepted fact that it was Bill Frazier. Warren Commission Document 296 seems to make the best sense when we realize that Bill Randle may have indeed taken somebody that looked much like Lee Harvey Oswald to Austin that same morning, but it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. Eventually, Benny Joe Castor moved to Grand Prairie, Texas, 4 miles down the street from the shooting range where another Lee Harvey Oswald sighting, an altercation actually, was reported and documented in the Warren Report. 3.8 miles away, 10 minutes. On November 17, 1963, several witnesses said that a man resembling Lee Harvey Oswald had been seen at local rifle ranges behaving strangely. In particular, he fired rapidly at other people's targets. He did not seem to follow etiquette or protocol, and he was recognized later by employees and patrons after Oswald was arrested. Someone good enough to hit multiple targets in rapid succession might decide to move closer to the place where they can perform one of their favorite hobbies. Based on the coincidence of these events during the spring of 1963, I even wondered if Bill and Benny were setting out one afternoon to run to their favorite shooting range at the Sportsdrome just down the road in the next town, Grand Prairie, until Bill realized he was having car trouble. Why else would the passenger, I allege to be Benny, have a rifle in the trunk of a car he didn't own? Or could it be that between the gas station attendant and the shooting range employee who both reported these incidents after the assassination of President Kennedy, perhaps they too were simply being manipulated or orchestrated into planting these seeds for the Warren Commission to seize upon later, as they well did? It is highly likely that Bill Randle stopped at the gas station just there on the corner all the time and would be acquainted with the people. It seems that Benny Castor, likewise, may have had a favorite shooting range, and they likely knew him as a familiar. Curiously, the attendant reported that the driver of the car questioned the passenger's willingness to sell the rifle at such a low price. The driver is reported to have said, "You're not going to let it go for that. You paid $35 for it." The passenger then replied, "No, we need the money." Could that whole conversation have been a setup just to convince the investigators that the event was real? As many have suspected, were these two incidents merely a ruse? Perhaps even the informants who called the police later were prompted to do so. The Mayflower Addition, where Benny Castor used to live during the 1960s, used to be considered part of the greater Plymouth Park subdivision expansion. However, this particular part of the Mayflower Addition was an outlier, and coincidentally just 4 blocks away from the Roberts subdivision, even having a street named after its founder, W.H. Roberts. It appears W.H. Roberts again played property shepherd for 430 Collins. In November 1950, 430 Collins was bought by Roy and Laverne Rambo from none other than W.H. Roberts. In August of 1959, it was bought by Hammond and Emma Moore and held for many years until January 1966, when it was bought by Benny and Patsy Castor. But can we really connect the Rambos, the Moores, and the Castors? What anomalies are there? 430 Collins, Connections and Anomalies. April 1958, Mayor Paul C. Laird awards an additional 74-foot easement to Roy and Laverne Rambo's property. To this day, it still exists. It would appear that the Rambos had some sort of preferential treatment from Irving City Council. In August 1959, the Rambos sell to Hammond and Emma Moore. We will see that the Moores and the Castors shared many things in common throughout the Irving and Grand Prairie area. Those things were matrimonial, metallic, multitudinous, and Masonic. Part 6. Irving Freemasonry during the 1950s. On June 30th, 1930, Lee Castor, Artie Lee, married Edwin Moore, Jewel Edmund, which was a convergence of 2 prominent Irving families. During the 19th century, the Castors multiplied in great numbers throughout the Irving Grand Prairie area. Below represents only a fraction of the Castor lineage. Like the Castors, the Moores had an extensive family line throughout the Irving Grand Prairie area. Below represents only a fraction of the Moore lineage. By the 1960s, certain members of the Moore family owned a construction company specializing in welding, steelworks, and erecting metal structures. Yet again, we see another contractor within the network. Benny's father, Martin Castor, happens to be a welder by profession. Perhaps just an ironic coincidence, but the Moore's ad is on the actual same page as the Castor's personal listing. January 1966, the Moores sell to Benny Castor, the son of welder Martin E. Castor, roughly 2 years after the assassination. Perhaps the dust had settled, and this was a thank you. When Benny Castor moved to 430 Collins at the end of 1965, he lived 2 minutes from his boss and friend, Bill Randle. There is a reason why I suspect that Benny Castor received that house as a reward. Certain families had subdivisions and/or streets named after them. The Roberts subdivision was centered around Roberts Avenue, right in the middle of Western Hills, and the Mayflower Addition, where 430 Collins was located. Why would the Casters and the Moores merit subdivisions or streets unless they were being paid homage for their special relationships and deeds by members of the Irving City Council and Dallas County? The Casters were among some of the earliest settlers in the greater Irving area, claiming the land in 1895 near the intersection of Center and Shady Grove Roads. The Castor cabin is actually featured in Centennial Park. Henry Castor was born in Shady Grove, Texas in 1858. His parents had come to this area from Illinois in 1853. He and his son Edmund built a log cabin in 1887 near the northwest corner of today's Beltline and Shady Grove Roads. In 1936, the land was divided up among the Castor heirs, including Martin Castor, father of Benny and Lloyd Castor. In the uncanniest manner, certain lots in Castor Estates were purchased in 1952 by none other than Blaine and Martha Wilhoit, right-hand woman to Emmeline Manning of Manning Employment, before her passing. And then in 1962, the Wilhoits sold to none other than C.B. Hardy. Could it be in February of 1962, leading up to the infamous spring of 1962 when so many other curious events began to coincide? Could this transaction have been C.B. Hardy's way of laundering some form of payment in the property transaction? And could that have been the form of reward and payment to other conspirators in a way that the money could not necessarily have been traced through bank accounts? As it turns out, C.B. Hardy appears to have held certain properties until passing them on to his heirs. Castor Estates was one of them. I allege that C.B. Hardy, as well as the Wilhoit Mannings and other senior members of the Castor family, must have been friends or associated in some mutually beneficial way. Likewise, there is a Moore Street in Grand Prairie, Texas. You may not believe where it is. Moore Street is around the corner from where Benny Castor spent the latter part of his life, just down the street from the shooting range where, I allege, he used to go practice, sometimes with Bill Randle. It appears the Moores and the Castors were both influential enough to be memorialized in ways that involved the naming and claim of property within their exclusive network, and their domain is directly related to the two staged Lee Harvey Oswald sightings. Both the Moore and Castor families appear to have been heavily affiliated with Freemasonry, which will establish some very significant ties among certain members of the alleged property network. Benjamin Franklin and Harriet Elizabeth Castor bore several other children, including William Bill Andy Castor, uncle of Benny and Lloyd Castor, father of Hewitt Daniel Castor. Hewitt Castor can possibly be tied to the shooting range incident in Grand Prairie, as well as the property shepherd network. Hewitt Daniel Castor would have grown up in Irving around the same age as cousins Lloyd and Benny. Hewitt retired from both Ford Motor Company and Starmark Transportation. He was a 50-year member of Irving Masonic Lodge No. 1218 and was also a Shriner. The sirens may be ringing loudly in the minds of many conspiracy realists, as we have a closely related Castor family member, Hewitt Castor, acting openly as a member of Freemasonry. Hewitt Castor appears to have had numerous transactions within the Hensley Park subdivision of Grand Prairie over the years. Hewitt Castor owned and lived at 3213 Tribble Street in Grand Prairie, just 1 mile from the shooting range where Benny Castor most likely staged the Lee Harvey Oswald sighting. It is evident that, just as the Randles were conveniently located less than a mile from one Lee Harvey Oswald sighting, the Castors too had their territorial dominion where South Irving and North Grand Prairie meet. It was just a straight shot, 10 minutes down MacArthur Boulevard, ultimately arriving within just 1 mile down the road from the shooting range where the staged Lee Harvey Oswald incident occurred. Collins Street itself provides a real-life case study into how white-collar crime operated in Irving, Texas during this time. As it turns out, the investors in the Mayflower edition got caught by the IRS. so we have proof of shady deals directly in these Irving neighborhoods since the 1950s. Collins Street happens to be named after Mayflower Investment Company's president, Carr P. Collins, Sr., who is mentioned in a 1956 petition challenging the IRS's ruling of tax evasion against Mayflower Investment Company. The petition was denied, and Carr P. Collins, Sr. and other affiliates were found to be willfully negligent. Following is a bullet-point summary of the court record. Mayflower obtained a loan from its bank for Southern Homes in the sum of $150,000 and received in return Southern's promissory note due in 6 months for $162,300 plus 4% interest. The IRS found that the sum in the amount of $12,300 was improperly reported as interest instead of operating profit. The testimony is that the president of Southern Homes made the deal to provide the sum of $12,300 to Mayflower because he felt morally obligated to Collins, the president of Mayflower, for a loss he had sustained on a deal some 20 years earlier. Really? For most of its life, until the years here in question, Mayflower had enjoyed no taxable income. Its returns were prepared by its secretary-treasurer, Waller, who was its bookkeeper during its entire existence. On the trial below, Waller testified. He admitted that it was at all times such a company, but stated he had been under a misconception as to what constitutes a personal holding company. In fact, while testifying in the tax court, he stated two materially different understandings. One was the correct understanding, and the other was his admitted misunderstanding. So it seems that Mr. Waller can understand the tax code whenever it's convenient, and when he thinks he can get away with it, he might happen to misunderstand it. On each return, there was an item requiring an answer to the question, is the corporation a personal holding company within the meaning of Section 501 of the Internal Revenue Code? Waller testified that each year he answered no to this question. The tax court found that Waller's failure to file the personal holding company return was not due to reasonable cause, but was rather due to willful neglect. The court found that the action of Waller in willfully answering no year after year amounted to willful neglect. That's a polite way of saying guilty. I believe this real-life example fully validates my allegations that a white-collar crime network was actively thriving in the quiet community of Irving, Texas, so that the stage was already set when lower-ranking perpetrators, such as the Paynes, the Randles, the Frasers, and Young, Hewitt, Binney, and Lloyd Castor, were conveniently corralled into Western Hills and nearby subdivisions to perform their compartmentalized duties. To provide a different perspective, let's drive the route beginning at the intersection of Rock Island and Story Road, where the first alleged Lee Harvey Oswald sighting occurred. We could drive a half-mile down the road to Western Hills and stop in at 2439, where Bill and Lenny and Buell lived. We could walk down the street to Ruth and Michael Payne's house. We could go knock on the Roberts' door right there next door. We could go across the street where Marvin used to rent the house to Bill and Lenny. Then we could actually drive just a few minutes to Collins, where Mary and Benny also both lived. Then as we continued down to Shady Grove, we could actually run by Manning's employment, where Martha Wilhoit was. Then just a little further down the road, we have the place where Benny Castor grew up, under the roof of Martin Castor and his wife. Then in just 10 minutes, we can head south down to 3213 Tribble Drive, which was literally right next door to the shooting range where the other staged Lee Harvey Oswald incident occurred. Then we could take another 10-minute drive just down to 537 St. John's Way. Unfortunately, Benny Castor is no longer there. If we were to drive that entire circuit, it could be done in 30 minutes, making every stop 12 to 13 miles from beginning to end. Should we say that birds of a feather flock together? Is Benny Joe Castor the impersonator of Lee Harvey Oswald, who was based right there in Irving, Texas, right in the same neighborhood with all of the other alleged culprits? No wonder Bill Randle felt like he needed to whisk Benny away to Austin on the day of the assassination on a business trip. Another example in proximity. The Castor Cabin is now located 1 block from the Masonic Lodge, right in the heart of Irving. Their influence in the evolving city of Irving is undeniable. Freemasonry is legendary for its Washington, D.C. influence, but what about hometown USA? It appears the Marvin Randle Clock Tower in Whistletop Plaza is situated in a very deliberate manner, forming a perfect square in proportion to the Castor Cabin and the Masonic Lodge. Quite a cadre of Castors were Freemasons. 5 different Castor members are buried in the Masonic section of Oak Grove Cemetery. The Castors were a literal dynasty of Freemasons in Irving, Texas. Of the 32 known Castor family members buried in just Irving, Texas, at least 17 were open participants in Freemasonry. Hewitt Castor was cousin to Benny and Lloyd Castor, happened to live only 1 mile from the shooting range where Benny or Lloyd may have staged a Lee Harvey Oswald sighting, and his daughter eventually purchased a house on Collins, just 3 houses down from where Benny Castor used to live. Ruby and John Castor were members of the Order of the Eastern Star and Freemasonry. Liddy and William Castor were members of the Order of the Eastern Star and Freemasonry. Liddy Smith Castor's brother, Sumter Charles Smith, and his wife Perry Cooper were also members of Freemasonry and the Order of the Eastern Star. Mary Castor Ricketts' husband was a member of Freemasonry. Gerald Austin Rickett is also buried with his wife in the Masonic section of Oak Grove Cemetery. Gerald and Patsy Ricketts' twin children, Stephen and Linda Kay, are also buried in the Masonic section of Oak Grove Cemetery. Edith May Castor King was a member of the Order of the Eastern Star, and her husband Sam was a Freemason. Artie Lee Castor was a member of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, as symbolized by the double-headed eagle under his name, and his wife Jewel was a member of the Order of the Eastern Star. Also of significance regarding Jewel Castor, she was originally part of the Moore family, Jewel Edmund Moore Castor. Jewel's brother, Joe Moore, is also buried in the Masonic section of Oak Grove Cemetery, right next to her and Artie Castor. Helen Marie Moore Crawford and her husband, Robert Bowie Boozy, are both buried in the Masonic section of Oak Grove Cemetery. Leslie Leon Moore and his wife, Mary, were a Freemason and a member of the Order of the Eastern Star, respectively. As you may recall, Hammond and Emma Moore sold 430 Collins to Benny and Patsy Castor in 1966. Eventually, in 1979, Benny moved to his home on St. John's Way in Grand Prairie. Emma Moore, one of the sellers of 430 Collins to Benny Castor, was a daughter of the American Revolution. DAR was not overtly associated with Order of the Eastern Star, but there was often overlap. DAR was certainly a gateway to other sororital orders if an Irving woman of the 1960s was looking beyond patriotism for networking opportunities, as the Order of the Eastern Star appears to have had a literal monopoly of mothers to recruit potential members. Like Emma Moore, Martha Wilhoit was also a member of DAR. Remember Blaine and Martha Wilhoit? Martha was sister of Emmeline Lovelet Manning, who was running Manning's employment during the time Fraser and Oswald would have been placed to work at the schoolbook depository. Above Martha's name is the symbol for the Daughters of the American Revolution, an organization independent of Freemasonry, but often with overlapping adherents in the Order of the Eastern Star. Blaine, likewise, was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, as symbolized above his name. It would come as no surprise if the Wilhoits were also involved in Freemasonry, given its common overlap with the siblings of the American Revolution, as well as their past real estate dealings directly with the Castors and then to C.B. Hardy. Remember Noel L. Mealer? He was another contractor in Irving, Texas. He purchased 2439 West 5th Street in 1957, It appears Mueller held the house for only 6 months and flipped it to a Smith couple who held it for a little over 1 year and then sold it back to Mueller. Possible money laundering transaction? He then sold the house to Alfred E. Randle in November of 1962, the same month that Marvin Randle dumped 2514 West 5th, across from Ruth Payne. As can be seen on Noel Mueller's headstone, he was clearly involved in some sort of esoteric order. The 12-pointed star is common in certain societies, such as Rosicrucianism or some of the more mystical Masonic traditions. In Masonic imagery, the 5-pointed star represents the Order of the Eastern Star, as well as Demole International, which was a Masonic youth recruitment organization. This makes me think back yet again to young men like Buell Frazier, Lee Harvey Oswald, Benny Castor, Lloyd Castor. The lightning bolt is more customized and generally represents illumination, power, or divine inspiration, all of which are Masonic metaphors for the transformative path of knowledge, also a common symbol in military and intelligence circles. The overt influence that these families had through their sheer numbers must have been impressive. However, it is the covert influence through the pairing of not just the husbands, but often the wives as cooperatives in the Masonic agenda that establishes a cult-like cohesion that I can now point to as proof of a network that was in a position to orchestrate the staging of activities in Western Hills. They were tied together financially, matrimonially, politically, religiously, and fraternally. It seems if other families, such as W.H. and Dorothy Roberts, Michael and Ruth Payne, or Lenny and Bill Randle, could be tied to the Irving Freemasons, then it would indeed close the loop on my allegations of a tightly knit group that already existed in Irving and was then called into compartmentalized action. I believe I can point to one, if not two, of these families. Previously, I had noted Buell Frazier had joined the same church as Martha Wilhoit and C.B. Hardy by the early 1980s, and I had asked the question, just how long ago and how did Buell Frazier know about Mannings, if he had been going to this church? As this might imply that even the Fraziers were affiliated with people like the Wilhoits and C.B. Hardy as early as 1963, which would be a direct link between these people. The report by Rose, Stovall, and Adamczyk states that Lenny and Buell were also accompanied by a Reverend Campbell of Irving Baptist Church. However, Reverend E.W. Campbell actually went to the First Baptist Church of Irving, the same church as Martha Wilhoit and C.B. Hardy. It had not been called the Irving Baptist Church since 1940. As Reverend Campbell was a person close enough to the Fraziers to join them the entire time they were at the police station, it seems the report by Rose, Stovall, and Adamczyk makes it clear that Buell Frazier and Lenny Frazier were extremely close with members of the First Baptist Church of Irving as far back as 1963. As previously noted, their unacquaintance at such an institution during that time would have been virtually impossible. This would seem to negate all other tales and speculation about how Buell Frazier might have known to apply there at that specific employment agency. I suggest the Fraziers' connection to Martha Wilhoit via FBCI, the First Baptist Church of Irving, as far back as 1963, is also a direct link to Manning's employment. Likewise, E.W. Campbell appears to have been heavily involved in a secretive order complementary to Freemasonry as well. The Independent Order of Fellowship is a localized branch of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows. The Abilene Municipal Cemetery, where E.W. Campbell is buried, is a very prestigious historical landmark for both Freemasonry and the Odd Fellows. The oldest documented grave is that of Florence Phillips, who was buried in the Masonic section in 1881, shortly before the establishment of the local Masonic Lodge in 1882. Among the notables buried here are Mary Houston Morrow, Abilene Post mistress and daughter of General Sam Houston, and C.W. Merchant, who gave the land for the burial ground and helped establish Abilene. The first deed verifying the establishment of the Independent Order of Oddfellows Cemetery was dated August 1906. The burial sites for Freemasons and Oddfellows are literally right next to each other. Although there is currently no confirmed proof, I suspect that Lenny Fraser Randle and or Buell Fraser could have also been involved in the Order of the Eastern Star and or Freemasonry based on their ties with the Campbells and the Wilhoits. Noel L. Mealer, Order of the Eastern Star, Freemasons, Demole International, sold 2439 West 5th to Alfred Randle. Possible intelligence ties as well. E.W. Campbell, member of the Oddfellows, accompanied Lenny Randle to the police station and stayed until her return home with Buell Fraser. Martha and Blaine Wilhoit, DAR, SAR, suspected members of OES and Freemasonry. Sister of Emmeline Manning, managed Manning's employment during Fraser's hiring at the Texas School Book Depository. Bought Castor Estates properties and sold to C.B. Hardy. Lenny May Fraser Randle, possible member of the Order of the Eastern Star, daughter-in-law of Alfred Randle, wife of Bill Randle, sister of Buell Fraser. Buell Wesley Fraser, possible Freemason, brother of Lenny Randle, lived with Lenny and Bill Randle, drove Lee Harvey Oswald to work and to Western Hills weekly. We are certainly right to note the glaring coincidence that a person so tied to the First Baptist Church of Irving and Freemasonry, just as the Wilhoits were, is the man who, oddly enough, accompanied the Frasers to the Dallas police station and waited throughout their interrogation, riding home with them just before 2:00 a.m. Reverend E.W. Campbell sounds like one true friend to the Frasers. On April 27, 1961, President Kennedy delivered a speech. It was titled The President and the Press. However, it actually spoke to something else. As President Kennedy stated, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, as we are a people inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. Sound like the Freemasons or the Oddfellows? The President also states there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that is in my control. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. As the world sadly witnessed on that fateful day of November 22, 1963, President Kennedy prophetically stated, "Its dissenters are silenced." Could these members of the Irving community have been participants in the type of secretive network to which President Kennedy was referring? Several, if not all, members of this alleged ring share common traits. They were in Irving politics, they had military or intelligence backgrounds, they were contractors, some of them were known Freemasons, and I would allege that many of them are suspected Freemasons or their beneficiaries. Guess who else lived within minutes of a Masonic lodge? Despite being divorced and moving out of state, somehow Ruth and Michael Payne both wound up at the same retirement home. It's located just 4 miles from a Masonic lodge. Before his passing, Paul Barger, former Irving chief of police, eventually retired and moved 4.2 miles from the East Trinity Masonic Lodge in Rockwall, and he was 9 miles from the Hella Shrine Event Center in Garland. And guess who? Marina Oswald Porter wound up just 6 miles down the road from Paul Barger. Kenneth Reynolds' retirement ranch was just under 12 miles from the Masonic Lodge in Athens. Bill and Lenny Mae Randle had a plot of land out in Sulphur Springs where they were barely 12 miles away from a Masonic Lodge. Benny Castor lived a half a mile from the Masonic Lodge in Grand Prairie when he retired. Another Castor curiosity. Benjamin Franklin and Harriet Elizabeth Castor also had a daughter named Mary Elizabeth Castor. Mary Elizabeth Castor married a Frank Mishevsky of Cologne, Germany. This may validate the suspicions of Bolshevism and communism that ring back to Senator Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare era, as we have wealthy land buyers during the 1950s hailing from German, Slavic, and/or Russian origins, likely tied to Freemasonry in the evolving city of Irving, Texas. Mishevsky married to a Castor daughter, and McClovsky, who sold the Irving truck tracts to C.B. Hardy. And guess who? Beale Wesley Frazier lives less than 5 blocks from this Masonic lodge. I do realize thousands of people live within a few miles of a Masonic lodge in any given location. The difference is, most of those people cannot be directly tied to the network that existed in Irving, Texas during the 1950s and 60s that might have ultimately been somewhat responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Only a handful of people can be tied to that event, and I think we have thoroughly named them here. But were all these people really Freemasons? I can't really know, but my theory? Perhaps during the time that each of these blossoming communities were formed, Freemasons may have had certain geographic areas of influence where they were able to buy and use tracts of land for their purposes. If the Freemasons wanted to provide secure, affordable places for their flock to retire, those places might realistically be located near lodges, because back in the 1950s it appears that was the only way they could govern, by being in proximity. Now, 60 years later, they appear limited to provide such handouts within the same proximity of their influence in the 1950s. It is true that Freemasonry has historically been more prevalent in some U.S. states than others. Texas turns out to be one of the most active Masonic jurisdictions by number of lodges and members. The Grand Lodge of Texas in Waco is considered a major hub. Many of the early settlers in Texas, including Stephen F. Austin, were Freemasons. These settlers brought Masonic traditions from the American South. The first Masonic lodge in Texas was chartered in 1835 by the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. Holland Lodge No. 1 in Brazoria later moved to Houston. It was chartered while Texas was still considered part of Mexico. Texas Freemasons formed their own independent Grand Lodge on April 16, 1837, in Houston. It was called the Grand Lodge of the Republic of Texas, separate from the U.S. Grand Lodges. Sam Houston was a founding father of Texas and the only man to serve as president of the Republic, governor of 2 different U.S. states, and U.S. senator. He was raised in Cumberland Lodge No. 8 in Tennessee and actively supported Masonic principles and lodge activities in Texas. Anson Johnson, later president of the Republic of Texas, was the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the Republic of Texas. Mirabeau B. Lamar was the second president of Texas and a strong proponent of education. He was also a Freemason who supported the establishment of public institutions. Masons played key roles in the Texas Revolution from 1835 to 1836 and the drafting of the Texas Declaration of Independence. Several signers of the Texas Declaration were confirmed Freemasons. Masonic lodges often predated churches and town governments in frontier towns. Lodges commonly shared space with courthouses or schools and helped build infrastructure. How many other hometowns in America during the 1950s in a post-World War II era evolved around a secret network of Freemasons who were there to profit, who were there to help each other, and who were there to carry out the unthinkable if called upon? Part 7. Rods versus Rifle. I also observed that the husbands were protected by the buffer of their wives. The Roberts and Randle men were completely ignored, yet they were the owners of the homes in which these events transpired. They were not questioned by the Warren Commission, they were not publicly identified, and they were not publicly interviewed. Were they protected due to their military tenure, political influence, and/or possible underworld connections? I ask because one wife in particular may have paid a higher price. 3 significant events happened between August and October of 1963. Buell Fraser's placement at the Texas School Book Depository just 1 month before Oswald has always raised suspicion. However, curiously, Emmeline Manning, who owned and operated the employment agency, died just weeks before Buell Fraser was placed. Could she have protested her company's recruitment to play a role in the cover story, or somehow been an obstacle to how Fraser and/or Oswald would have been placed at the Texas School Book Depository, consequently getting whacked? Such circumstances should be investigated. A copy of Emmeline Manning's death certificate from August 20th, 1963 states that she died of acute granulocytic leukemia, also referred to as AML. The likelihood of an adult getting AML is relatively rare. In the United States, the annual incidence is about 4 cases per 100,000 people. Most cases occur in people over age 60, though it can develop at any age. Emmeline Manning would have been 50. Among those who do get it, dying within a year of diagnosis is, sadly, not uncommon. Although the possibility of Emmeline Manning getting this disease is realistic, at the time she was diagnosed, it is certainly still coincidental with other events during that time in the spring of 1962 and then still leading up only a few weeks before placement of Buell Fraser at the book depository. The information about her disease was provided by none other than Charles Manning. Can poisoning mimic AML? Yes, certain types of poisoning, especially chronic repeated poisoning, can cause symptoms very similar to AML, including arsenic poisoning, as well as thallium or lead poisoning. I realize my insinuation has no further physical evidence to support it. As the death certificate indicates, no autopsy was performed. How unfortunate for the public, as well as convenient for anybody who might have been up to no good during this time. For those answers, I must pass the baton to any local or federal investigative agency that might choose to get involved. These are all valid questions that could have been investigated 60 years ago. The heinous depth of such depravity may very well be why the name Manning never came up until 2021. What about the other men? I suggest that Michael Payne was marginally questioned and his TV interviews were done to corroborate the false notion that Oswald was a real communist when he was really being groomed by the CIA as a communist infiltrator. I suggest that Buell Fraser was a likely second patsy that would be burned if necessary. His degree of foreknowledge remains a mystery. However, we have clues. The Warren Commission ignored the Frasers' testimony and tried to pressure them into a different story. From his book, Steering Truth, Buell Fraser states, "I remember that when he questioned me, he always tried to trip me up. I was skeptical. I kept trying to figure out what they wanted. I told them what I had said from day one, and after a while, I got the feeling they didn't seem to want to buy it. Honestly, their actions really said they were not interested in finding the truth. It was like the whole process was a formality. Who knows? Maybe they had the whole report written even before Lenny and I landed in D.C. The biggest point of contention between Buell Fraser and examiner attorney Joseph Ball was the size of the homemade paper sack that was allegedly used to conceal the rifle as Lee Harvey Oswald walked with it in open public, both from the Payne's house to meet up with Buell Fraser and also from the parking lot to the Texas School Book Depository. This was problematic for the Warren Commission because it meant the size of the package was not long enough to have contained the Carcano rifle found on site, even if disassembled. The Frazier's testimony allegedly contradicted the evidence found on site at the Texas School Book Depository, as the sack appears long enough to hold a rifle. However, despite repeated questions that bordered on badgering, and after being made to physically reconstruct multiple specimens of the craft paper package that Lee Harvey Oswald was carrying, Buell and Linney maintained that the sack they witnessed Lee Harvey Oswald carrying was only about 2 feet long, give or take a few inches. Coincidentally, 28 inches is the starting point for a standard set of curtain rods, which was what Lee Harvey Oswald stated was in the package to Buell Frazier. Buell Frazier also testified that he saw Oswald carry the package lengthwise, with one end under his armpit and the other end cupped within the palm of his hand, i.e., too short to be a rifle, even if disassembled. The Warren Commission rejected the Frazier's testimony regarding the package length because it did not support their presumption that it contained the rifle. Let's take the Frazier's testimony at their words and accept that the package was truly only 28 inches long, and then speculate on what else might have been in the package. The sack, in its original condition, contained equally spaced folds. If Oswald was being set up with instructions to carry out some sort of mission, he may very well have been told to make a package that was much longer than necessary, and then provided real curtain rods to carry inside of it. The folds would have accommodated the excess length after inserting a pair of standard-sized curtain rods, which start at 28 inches. In November of 1963, Buell Frazier originally stated that he observed multiple folds at the top and bottom of the package. At the top of the sack was sort of folded up, and the rest of the sack had been kind of folded under. Before the Warren Commission in 1964, Frazier obscures the matter at 2 different times during the interview. Mr. Ball, was one end of the sack turned over, folded over, do you remember that? Mr. Frazier, I didn't see very much of it. If he had anything folded up in it, I didn't see that. Mr. Ball, was it folded over when you saw it the first time, folded over to the end? Mr. Frazier, I will say I'm not sure about that, whether it was folded over or not, because, like I say, I didn't pay that much attention to it. We must acknowledge another self-contradiction by Lenny Randle. In her original November 1963 statement to the FBI, she reportedly described a package long enough to carry a rifle, approximately 3 feet long. Let us suppose the package really had been 3 to 3.5 feet long and even contained the rifle. In that case, it may be from the time Buell and Linney gave their statements in November 1963 to the time they gave their Warren Commission testimonies in the spring of 1964, they had likely gotten legal counsel as well as had time to consider their degree of implication. If they had confirmed that they had even a suspicion of a rifle, then they might have been accused of not reporting it and thereby an accessory to the crime. This is a possibility that works against Linney's innocence, appearing she changed her story, but I think there's a better alternative explanation. Possibility number 2. Linney's first written record of a package being 3 feet long may have been purposefully influenced or misdocumented by the investigator. The FBI already assumed the package held a rifle. It also seems implausible that Oswald, the person duped into being the patsy, would be trusted to carry such a conspicuous weapon down the street in Irving and Dallas. And, unlike his sister Linney, Buell Frazier's testimony has always been consistent. He was the closest eyewitness to the package and never caved in under pressure to state that the sack was longer. Even if I cannot rely on Linney, I will go ahead and take Buell Frazier's word regarding the size of the package. So in that case, Oswald may well have carried actual curtain rods to work on November 22nd in the brown paper package he was observed to bring into the building. The Warren Commission's extremely weak response to this possibility is as follows. They stated the room had Venetian blinds, curtain rods, and curtains while Oswald was living there. The curtain rods in the Payne garage that belonged to Mrs. Payne were still there after Oswald went to work on November 22nd. So let's analyze this a little closer. The room already had Venetian blinds, curtain rods, and curtains while Oswald was living there, i.e., what possible purpose would he need for an extra set of curtain rods? And then, of course, he left them behind in Ruth Payne's garage and chose to take the rifle to work instead. If you consider the exact recounting of the conversation, Buell Frazier said that Lee Harvey Oswald told him the curtain rods were for an apartment. Fraser did not say that Oswald told him it was for his own apartment. It would also seem if Lee Harvey Oswald was simply a tenant, the landlady would be responsible for replacing any curtain rods as a fixture of the apartment. With a home builder like W.H. Roberts next door, the Paynes certainly would have had access to an abundance of curtain rods. Therefore, it is plausible that Oswald was set up by Ruth Payne, who may have asked him to take curtain rods to the book depository for some other reason. What purpose would that serve? The Carcano rifle in Ruth Payne's garage had always been concealed in a blanket, which would have already worked just fine to conceal the rifle. Therefore, by having Oswald hand-fabricate and carry a craft paper sack with clear packaging tape, it was sure to leave fingerprints that would connect him to an alleged murder weapon that he may not have even touched. Why keep extra curtain rods? They're not typically a consumable item that might require replacement any time in the next 2 to 3 decades. Most curtain rods are built to perform and last. They are not an item of urgent need that must have a spare kept on hand in order to avoid what would otherwise be an inconvenience. It appears the curtain rods were there because Ruth may have presented them to Lee as a suggestion and, for that matter, could have had an extra set to provide him with a choice, which explains how Buell Fraser could witness Oswald carrying a package that was no bigger than a set of curtain rods into the building, and yet there was another set in the Payne's garage. This is a very plausible explanation that answers this mystery. The Warren Commission and mainstream media narrative during that time, as told by Ruth Payne herself, pointed out that when investigators came to her home in the garage, they found the empty blanket that Oswald's rifle had been wrapped in, as well as the set of curtain rods in her garage. The effect of not having a rifle present is simply an absence of evidence, and an implication of a murder weapon that cannot be proven by its absence at a given location. The set of curtain rods that Oswald was supposed to have allegedly taken with him seems to have been deliberately planted in the garage to help drive home the false notion that Lee had made a choice to take the rifle instead of the curtain rods. Based on Ruth Payne's credibility at this point, I simply refuse to buy it. Lennie Mae Randle yet again only validates this doubt. In her November 28, 1963 Secret Service testimony, she simply seems too eager to connect a casual curtain rod conversation with the murder weapon. Oswald asked my brother if he could ride home with him, as he wanted to pick up some curtain rods Mrs. Payne had for him. My brother said he said this would be all right. After the shooting, I immediately tied these events to the Texas School Book Depository job of Oswald in my mind. Part 8. Why did Buell Wesley Fraser wait in the car on the morning of the assassination? In 1964, Fraser also provided the following testimony before the Warren Commission. When they had arrived for work that morning, he said he was letting my engine run and getting to charge up my battery because when you stop and start, you have to charge up your battery. I was watching the gauges and watched the car for a few minutes before I cut it off. Then he goes on to describe Lee Harvey Oswald's behavior. He walked down behind the car and standing over there at the end of the cyclone fence, waiting for me to get out of the car. And so quick as I cut the engine off and started out of the car, shut the door, just as I was starting out, like getting out of the car, he started walking off. And so I followed him. I didn't try to catch up with him because I knew I had plenty of time. So I just took my time walking up there. Mr. Ball questioned, "Did you usually walk up there together?" Mr. Fraser, "Yes, sir, we did." Mr. Ball, "Is this the first time that he had ever walked ahead of you?" Mr. Fraser, "Yes, sir, he did." Why did Buell Fraser wait in the car? My theory, during the brief 20-minute drive, could Buell Fraser have suspected something, while likewise not indulging his suspicion so far that he felt it was necessary to report it? Or could it even be that, like Ruth Payne, Lennie Mae Randle, and consequently her young brother, Buell Fraser, were somehow manipulated into playing a seemingly innocent role while having some degree of knowledge either before, during, or after the assassination took place? I believe, based on the evidence I've considered here, that a 19-year-old Buell Fraser somehow may have been recruited or asked to participate in a special project while having minimal knowledge of what he was getting involved in. I believe he must have realized too late what happened and has lived with the knowledge that Lee Harvey Oswald was an innocent man who was set up and then murdered to maintain his silence. and perhaps that certain relatives of his had likely been involved. It appears that, out of homage and respect for Lee Harvey Oswald, who he has always believed was an innocent man, Fraser has maintained his testimony, even when it would have been so much easier for him to have simply given in to the conspiracy's narrative. Instead, Fraser has always maintained that, number one, the package was only about 28 inches long and carried under Lee Harvey Oswald's armpit, extending to his palm. Number two, while quiet and peculiar, Lee Harvey Oswald loved his child and his wife, and he was always pleasant with Buell Fraser. To this day, Fraser continues to profess Oswald's innocence. Buell Fraser appears to have enough integrity to protect the reputation of a framed man, but I imagine he has likewise understandably felt the need to maintain silence about the familial matters upon which I have cast light here. Around 2021, Buell Fraser has offered explanations in interviews and in his book that he remained silent for a very long time because he felt intimidated by two different encounters with gunmen. One in the parking lot of the depository right after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, in Steering Truth, pages 162 through 163. I can tell you this. Keeping my mouth shut has probably kept me alive. I was so scared, but I never fully explained to anybody publicly why I was so afraid. People have said for years, Buell knows more than he's letting on. Guess what? You're right. After giving it a lot of thought and prayer, I feel like the time has come to share what happened. Buell Fraser continues. As I paused to turn around and go back to the entrance of the Texas School Book Depository, a man walked up carrying a rifle. I was terrified. He bore a hole right through me with his brown eyes. And I said, "Don't worry, I didn't see anything." Then Buell Fraser tells us the very next day there was another gunman spotted down the street from his home. The next day I was outside of Lenny and Bill's house at my car, which was parked on the other side of the carport. I looked down the street and noticed a man getting out of a plain, dark blue four-door Ford that was just down the street from our house. In his hand was a rifle. Buell Fraser goes on to state that he and Lenny called the Irving police, who arrived to speak with the man casually from the car window without getting out. After a few minutes, they both then drove away. As much as I admire Mr. Fraser for his courage, these are very far-fetched stories. While I believe he did live in fear of winding up like Lee Harvey Oswald after the assassination, I believe there were other more governing reasons for his silence. I have a suspicion that Buell Fraser has felt compelled to perpetuate such stories because he must steer around the truth that the real concerns to him and his sister were even closer to home than an unidentified man parked down the street. There was a father figure receiving their rent check, a brother-in-law providing mentorship under the same roof, and another close member who eventually ran the city as mayor. In 2021, during an interview at the School Book Depository Museum, Fraser was asked how he thought the rifle got into the book depository if he did not believe Lee Harvey Oswald took it in. His response: I think this is going to happen. Sometimes when you have estate sales, people buy different things, and this, my theory is that someone has bought someone's library and people are in there boxing up books and somebody tries to pick up more books than they can handle and one falls on the floor. Well, they reach around and they pick it up and it's open. If you stop and think about it, every book that you purchase, if you look at the back of the book, there's blank pages. Well, then on this particular book, I think there's going to be something on that page. It's not going to be blank. I have believed from the very day one that I think this terrible tragedy was committed by a conspiracy. Now, some people believe that, some don't. But getting back to the book, and the back of that book is going to be written all the key players that form this conspiracy and why they worked together to assassinate this man. Fraser goes on to say, it's widely known that John Kennedy and his brother Bobby, they wanted to change how things were done in Washington, D.C., and some of these people that they wanted to change and take out of power didn't like that theory at all. Now, are their names on that list? I don't know. Could be. I haven't seen the book. I don't know whether it'll happen in my lifetime. But here's the thing. I think when you read that, If that is a possibility, and it does happen, after reading it, people are going to ask, is this really what happened on November 22nd, 1963? Could Mr. Fraser be speaking of himself, holding that book with the filled pages at the end until his own estate sale? Could the surviving members of the Blaylock, Hardy, Manning, Mealer, Randle, Roberts, and Reynolds families, their business records, or their business associates know more? I do not mean to accuse any of these families for any wrongdoing. However, I do wonder if our federal government might think that the information provided here merits further investigation. Better yet, who else among the Washington, D.C. level conspirators could still be brought for questioning? With so many implications that were never considered and deliberately ignored, isn't it time to reopen the investigation? Thank you so much for riding with me to the end of this journey. I sincerely appreciate your time and your consideration.